In a quiet Illinois suburb, Jane Evans, a beloved lunch lady, secretly gives food to Ethan, a malnourished boy, defying strict school policies. When supervisor Frank Pearson catches her, he issues harsh warnings, threatening her job. Tension rises as Ethan collapses from hunger, and Jane faces humiliation. Yet, whispers of her kindness spread. One day, a limousine and SUVs arrive, hinting at Ethan's mysterious background. Who is this boy, and why does Jane's compassion provoke such scrutiny? The school holds its breath, unaware that Jane's small acts are about to unravel a life-changing secret. Inspired by Jane's compassion? Subscribe to my channel for more heartwarming stories that spark change. Support our mission to highlight unsung heroes and share tales of kindness. In the fall of 2010, Crest View Elementary School stood on the fringe of a peaceful Illinois suburb, its playground strewn with vibrant leaves that danced in the October wind. The cafeteria buzzed with the gentle murmur of children's voices and the clatter of trays. Jane Evans, a 54-year-old lunch lady with 22 years of service, moved with quiet efficiency behind the counter. Her silver hair was tucked neatly under a hairnet, and her warm eyes sparkled as she greeted each child by name, remembering their small preferences. The boy who needed his peas kept separate, the girl who turned up her nose at bread crusts. "Good morning, sweetie," she'd say, her voice a soft balm, often slipping an extra piece of fruit to those whose faces looked too thin, whose eyes held a shadow of want. Jane lived alone in a modest apartment, her days anchored by the school's rhythm. She arrived before dawn, humming as she prepped meals, and lingered late, cleaning counters after the last bus left. Her devotion was a quiet vow. No child would feel invisible on her watch. At a lone table, 9-year-old Ethan Miller sat hunched, his frail body dwarfed by a worn sweater, its edges frayed. His dark eyes stayed glued to his tray, avoiding the curious or wary glances of other kids, who seemed to sense a barrier around him. Ethan spoke little, his hands moving slowly as he picked at his food, tucking bits into his pockets with a secretive care that tugged at Jane's heart. She saw how he savored each bite, as if it might be his last for the day. To Jane, Ethan was more than a face in the lunch line. He was a quiet call to action, a reminder of the world's sharp edges. She longed to shield him, to fill his world with the warmth of a full plate and a kind word. Tensions had been mounting for weeks, sparked by the district's new food waste rules, a rigid policy that banned sharing leftovers. That Wednesday, Jane's heart couldn't take the sight of Ethan's gaunt face. As he passed her station, she slipped a paper bag of sandwiches and fruit into his backpack. Her touch light but firm, but a harsh voice shattered the moment. "This is theft of school property." Frank Pearson, the new district supervisor, towered over them, his face a mask of cold authority. He snatched the bag from Jane's shaking hands as Ethan stood rooted, tears welling in his sunken eyes, spilling silently down his face. The cafeteria seemed to pause, staff and students alike turning away, their silence a heavy curtain. Jane's smile faded, replaced by a piercing ache she buried deep. "It's all right, honey," she whispered to Ethan, though her voice trembled with the lie. The boy looked ready to flee, his body quaking with shame. Frank's voice dripped with scorn as he led Jane to his office, the bag held like a trophy. There he thrust a warning form at her, his pen jabbing the page. "One more slip, Mrs. Evans, and you're out. 22 years mean nothing." Jane signed, her hands steady but her heart in chaos. As she returned to the cafeteria, each step felt like wading through molasses. Ethan's tearful face burned into her mind. His table was empty now, his absence a silent rebuke in the crowded room. Jane lingered there, her hands clasped, fighting tears. She wondered where he'd gone, picturing him curled up in some hidden corner, alone with his pain. The thought clawed at her, whispering she'd failed him. The cafeteria grew tense in the days after, the air thick with unspoken defiance. Frank's policies were part of a district-wide cost-cutting spree, a truth everyone saw through his claims of food safety. At staff meetings, he'd drone, "Rules are rules," his thin lips barely twitching, his gaze daring anyone to challenge him. Whispers circulated about budgets, not safety, driving the changes. Frank added cameras, their lenses fixed on Jane's station like unblinking judges. He tallied every item, apples, milk cartons, with a precision that felt like a personal vendetta. Jane grew wary, but her heart wouldn't yield. Ethan's face haunted her, his silent gratitude fueling her resolve. She'd slip wrapped sandwiches into his backpack when no one looked, murmuring, "Just leftovers. Don't fret." Ethan's eyes, wide with worry but soft with trust, made her chest ache. Kyle, a young coworker saving for college, saw her quiet acts. One afternoon as they scrubbed trays, he whispered, "I'd help, Jane, but I need this job. College isn't cheap." His guilt was palpable, and Jane offered a sad smile, patting his hand. "Looking away can be its own kindness," she said, though it cost her to say it. She knew the fear of losing a livelihood, how it bound even good people. Alone, Jane carried the risk, her nights restless with thoughts of Frank's clipboard and what another warning might mean. But each dawn, she returned, her smile unwavering, her hands ready to give. No one foresaw that Jane's small act of kindness would ripple outward, reaching far beyond the school's walls. One afternoon, a limousine and 3 black SUVs rolled up to the gates, silencing the cafeteria's hum. Trays stilled, eyes turned, as Ethan's quiet existence became a mystery that would stun even the mighty. Jane Evans had poured her heart into teaching for 22 years, but now as she stood in the school's walk-in freezer, her hands trembled, not from the cold, but from a crushing sense of defeat. Tears streamed down her face, freezing in the icy air, as she scrawled her mandatory self-critique for the district's employee improvement plan. The exercise felt like a public shaming, a ritual designed to strip her of dignity rather than foster growth. Her mind churned with the weight of the day's events, replaying the emergency meeting where Frank, the district supervisor, had slammed a folder onto the desk, his voice booming with accusation. "You're on your last warning, Jane," he declared, his words slicing through her like a blade. "One more step out of line, and you're done. 22 years won't save you." The principal had sat silently, shifting uncomfortably, offering no defense as Frank's tirade filled the room. Jane had always believed her dedication would shield her, but now she felt exposed, vulnerable, and utterly alone. The whispers among her colleagues hadn't helped. During lunch breaks, some teachers had begun to gossip, their voices low but sharp. "Jane's breaking protocol," one had said, stirring her coffee with a judgmental frown. "We all have struggling students. Why is she bending over backward for just one?" Another chimed in, her tone laced with resentment. "If we all started playing favorites and ignoring the rules, this place would fall apart." Their words stung, burrowing into Jane's heart. She hadn't meant to defy anyone. She'd only wanted to help Ethan, a boy who seemed to carry the weight of the world in his hollowed-out frame. She saw him every day in the cafeteria, his thin shoulders hunched, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion. Some mornings he arrived without having eaten breakfast, the dark circles beneath his eyes growing deeper with each passing week. Jane's maternal instincts screamed to do something, anything. But the system she worked within felt like a maze of red tape, designed to keep her hands tied. Ethan's decline was impossible to ignore. The school nurse had noticed his frail appearance, but with 60 students requiring daily medications, she was stretched too thin to do more than jot a note in his file. Jane's heart ached as she watched him shuffle through the lunch line, his tray often only a single apple or a carton of milk. She'd slipped him extra food when she could, a quiet act of rebellion against the rules that forbade such favors. But her kindness had drawn Frank's wrath, and now she was paying the price. The following Tuesday, during math class, Ethan's fragile body gave out. He collapsed, his small frame crumpling to the floor as his teacher's panicked voice called for help. Jane, hearing the commotion from the cafeteria, dropped everything and ran toward the classroom, her heart pounding with dread. But Frank intercepted her in the hallway, his broad frame blocking her path as students watched, wide-eyed. "Let the nurse handle it, Mrs. Evans," he said, his voice loud enough to echo through the hallway. "You're not his mother." The words cut deeper than any warning, humiliating her in front of the students she'd dedicated her life to. Ethan was rushed to the hospital for IV fluids and observation, and when Jane quietly asked for his room number, Frank was there again, his voice icy. "You're crossing professional boundaries," he warned. "That's grounds for immediate termination." That night, Jane sat at her kitchen table, the employee handbook open before her, its pages a blur through her tear-filled eyes. 22 years of service, countless hours spent grading papers, comforting students, and advocating for those who had no one else. Yet she'd never felt so powerless. Her arthritis medication, costing nearly $400 a month, loomed over her like a guillotine. Without her job, she'd lose her health insurance, and the thought of navigating her chronic pain without relief was unbearable. But Ethan's gaunt face haunted her, his hollow cheeks and tired eyes etched into her memory. She knew his parents worked grueling minimum wage jobs, leaving before dawn and returning long after he'd fallen asleep. They were doing their best, but the system meant to support children like Ethan was fractured, its cracks wide enough for him to slip through unnoticed. Jane wrestled with her conscience, wondering if her small acts of kindness were doing more harm than good. She felt trapped, torn between her duty to follow the rules and her instinct to protect a child who had no one else. The following Friday, a commotion outside the school. Friday shattered her classroom routine. Students pressed their faces against classroom, staring, ignoring their teachers' calls for order. A sleek black limousine flanked by three imposing SUVs with government plates and military flags rolled up to the front entrance. Frank burst out from his office, fumbling to straighten his tie, his face a mix of confusion and anxiety. "Is that the superintendent?" he muttered, glancing around at the principal, who looked equally bewildered. "That's not the superintendent's car," the principal replied, his voice tinged with unease. Security guards emerged from the vehicles, their movements precise and practiced as they scanned the students. Then a tall man in a decorated Navy uniform stepped out, his chest adorned with medals and ribbons that gleamed in the afternoon sun. Even the children peering through sensed his authority. Beside him stood a young man in an officer's uniform, his posture confident and strong. The history teacher whispered, catching sight of the older man, gasped. "That's Admiral Miller," she whispered, her voice trembling with recognition. "He's the Joint Chief's advisor. Why is he here?" Frank's face drained of color, but his words halted as he caught sight of the younger officer. There was something familiar about him. The man's face, now filled out and healthy, but unmistakable to those who'd seen him years ago in the cafeteria. A teacher whispered, "Is that Ethan?" The group marched with purpose through the hallways, the principal scrambling to keep up with students trailing behind. Whispers trailed in their wake, a ripple of awe spreading through the school. By the time they reached the cafeteria, it seemed the whole school had gathered, drawn by the spectacle. The room fell silent as the Admiral stepped forward, his voice calm but commanding. "Where's Mrs. Evans?" he asked. Jane, standing by the serving counter, her hair disheveled from the lunch rush, froze. Her heart raced, unsure whether this moment would bring salvation or ruin. Frank, suddenly eager to please, stepped forward with a forced smile. "Admiral, what an unexpected honor," he said, his voice dripping with warmth. "I'm the district supervisor. How can I assist you?" But the young officer, Ethan, now grown and radiating confidence, brushed past him, taking the microphone used for morning announcements. His gaze locked on Jane, and in that moment, the weight of her sacrifices, her fears, and her quiet acts of kindness seemed to converge, poised to unfold in ways she could never have imagined. 8 years had passed, but the memory of those cold, hungry days still lingered in Ethan Miller's heart as he stood before the crowded cafeteria at Crest View Elementary. His voice, once a timid whisper that barely carried across a room, now rang with a quiet strength that commanded attention. He wore the crisp uniform of a Naval Academy graduate, his chest adorned with the promise of a bright future, yet his eyes held the weight of a past he could never forget. "Mrs. Evans," he began, his gaze locking onto the woman who stood near the serving line, her apron slightly wrinkled from a morning of work. "You saved me when no one else even noticed I was drowning." Jane Evans, the lunch lady who had spent decades quietly ensuring no child went hungry, froze in place. Her hands, calloused from years of slicing fruit and scrubbing trays, flew to her mouth as a gasp escaped her lips. She hadn't expected this. A camera crew weaving through the tables, their lenses capturing every tremor of emotion on her face. The students, teachers, and parents packed into the room buzzed with curiosity, their eyes darting between Ethan and Jane. But it was Frank Pearson, the former cafeteria supervisor, whose face betrayed a flicker of dread. His usual air of authority seemed to crumble, as Ethan's words sliced through the air. Ethan's voice grew steadier as he painted a picture of his childhood, each detail a brushstroke of raw vulnerability. 8 years ago, my father was deployed overseas, fighting for our country. My mother worked 3 jobs, her hands raw from cleaning houses and her eyes hollow from sleepless nights. At home, we often had no heat, no electricity. Most days I came to school with an empty stomach, the kind of hunger that makes it hard to think, to hope. The room fell silent, save for the soft rustle of tissues being pulled from pockets. Admiral Miller, Ethan's father, stood nearby, his weathered face etched with pride and pain. He nodded solemnly, his own memories of those dark days mirrored in his son's words. Mrs. Evans didn't just hand me a tray of food here at school, Ethan continued, his voice catching with gratitude. She made sure I had something to eat at home. Those stolen leftovers, he said, turning to face Frank directly, his eyes unflinching, were what kept me alive on weekends when our kitchen was bare. Frank seemed to shrink under the weight of Ethan's gaze, his shoulders hunching as murmurs rippled through the crowd. The accusation hung in the air, unspoken but undeniable. Frank had once scolded Jane for giving away food, dismissing her compassion as a violation of rules. Ethan's story unfolded like a tapestry of resilience. After his father was wounded in combat, the family relocated near Walter Reed for his treatment. Ethan threw himself into his studies, earning a scholarship to Annapolis through sheer determination. But even as he stood on the cusp of a promising career, his heart remained tethered to the woman who had seen him when he felt invisible. "I never forgot you, Mrs. Evans," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "You gave me more than food. You gave me hope." Admiral Miller stepped forward, his presence commanding yet warm. In his hands was an official commendation, its gold seal glinting under the cafeteria lights. "Mrs. Evans," he said, his voice steady but thick with emotion, "on behalf of a grateful nation, we honor your compassion that changed the course of my son's life." Jane's eyes welled with tears as she accepted the award, her hands trembling. She had never sought recognition, only the quiet satisfaction of knowing a child felt cared for. Then came a moment that left the room breathless. Ethan and his father announced the creation of the Evans Angel Scholarship Fund, a $1.5 million initiative to support struggling children across the state. Teachers gasped, their hands clasped in disbelief, while students erupted into wild applause. Jane stood motionless, overwhelmed by the scale of it all. Frank, meanwhile, stood alone at the edge of the crowd, the target of sidelong glances and whispered judgments. Public pressure and the sudden scrutiny of his superiors forced him to stammer an apology, his words clumsy and tinged with regret. Jane accepted it with a grace that surprised even herself, her heart too full to hold on to resentment. When Jane finally took the microphone, her voice was soft but clear, each word laced with the weight of her tears. "I only ever wanted one child to feel seen," she said, her eyes sweeping across the sea of faces. "That's enough for me." The students surged forward, forming a line to hug their lunch lady, their arms wrapping around her in a wave of gratitude. In that moment, something shifted in Crest View Elementary. The way they saw Jane transformed. She was no longer just the woman behind the counter, but a beacon of kindness. Ethan's story opened their eyes to the invisible struggles many children carried, and the school would never be the same. Jane's story didn't end in that cafeteria. Within days, local news outlets picked up the story, and soon it spread across the country. Good Morning America invited Jane for a segment, and she appeared in her familiar cafeteria uniform, her hair neatly tucked under a net. "I'm just a lunch lady," she said, her voice tinged with bewilderment as the host wiped away tears. Viewers across the nation disagreed, flooding the Evans Angel Scholarship Fund with donations. Individuals, corporations, and even celebrities contributed, and within months, the fund provided free lunches to hundreds of children and college scholarships to dozens more. Frank Pearson, reeling from the backlash, resigned from his position. But in an unexpected twist, he found redemption volunteering at a local food bank. "Mrs. Evans taught me what rules can't measure," he admitted in a newspaper interview 6 months later, his voice softer, humbler. The school board voted unanimously to rename the cafeteria Evans Hall, installing a plaque that read, "Where every child is seen." At the ceremony, Jane blushed but stood a little taller, her heart swelling with quiet pride. Admiral Miller and Ethan became regular visitors to Crest View, bringing Navy officers to inspire students with talks about perseverance. The school established an annual service and sacrifice day, where uniformed personnel served lunch alongside Jane, their laughter mingling with the clatter of trays. The community created Evans Day, a tradition where local restaurants offered free meals to any child, no questions asked, and businesses competed to donate the most to food pantries. Jane formed a deep bond with the Miller family, becoming an honorary grandmother to children across the community whose families struggled. Her phone buzzed constantly with texts from kids who knew she'd listen when no one else would. On social media, the hashtag Evans Effect trended as people shared stories of their own unsung heroes, and memes celebrating the lunch lady hero spread like wildfire. What began as a secret sandwich in a small-town cafeteria had become a movement, a reminder that kindness, no matter how small, could ripple outward and change the world. In towns across America, the tireless efforts of cafeteria workers began to gain the recognition they had long deserved, shining a spotlight on one of the most underappreciated roles in the education system. Schools from coast to coast adopted what became known as the Evans Protocols, a set of guidelines inspired by a single act of kindness. These protocols empowered school staff to quietly assist hungry students, offering them meals without judgment or fear of consequences. No longer were children turned away because of unpaid lunch balances. Instead, they were met with warmth and understanding. A small but profound shift that transformed countless lives. In the halls of Congress, lawmakers invoked the story of Jane Evans, a humble cafeteria worker from a small Illinois town, as they pushed for expanded funding for school meal programs. Her story became a rallying cry, a testament to the power of compassion in a system often bound by bureaucracy. Her town, once an unremarkable dot on the map, emerged as a beacon of hope, a national model for what education could be when it prioritized people over policies. Educators from far and wide made pilgrimages to this quiet community, eager to learn about the Crest View approach, a philosophy that placed human dignity above rigid rules. They marveled at how a single woman's courage could ripple outward, reshaping not just a school, but an entire nation's perspective. 5 years after her simple act of defiance, Jane sat in the warmth of her newly renovated kitchen, a heartfelt gift from a community forever changed by her kindness. The room was filled with the soft glow of evening light, casting shadows across countertops that gleamed with gratitude. Through her window, she could see the faint, radiant outline of Evans Hall, its illuminated sign a quiet tribute to her legacy. The sight stirred a deep sense of fulfillment in her chest, a warmth that no amount of winter chill could touch. She wasn't one for fanfare, but the honor of having a building named after her filled her with a quiet pride, not for herself, but for the children whose lives she had touched. On her refrigerator, a mosaic of photographs told stories of triumph and transformation. There was Ethan, beaming in his wedding tuxedo, his eyes bright with the future Jane had helped make possible. Other snapshots captured children she'd quietly fed over the years, kids who might have gone hungry without her intervention. Now they were graduating from college, cradling newborns, or carving out their own paths in the world. Each photo was a reminder of the ripple effect of her choices, a gallery of lives forever altered by a single meal offered without hesitation. In a drawer nearby, she kept a collection of cards and letters, each one a handwritten testament to the difference she'd made. On days when the world felt heavy, when doubt or exhaustion crept in, Jane would open that drawer, letting the words of gratitude wash over her like a balm. "Thank you for seeing me," one letter read. "You gave me more than a meal. You gave me hope," said another. Each note was a lifeline, a reminder that her heart had always been in the right place. That December evening, as snow dusted the ground outside, Jane stood at her counter, preparing sandwiches for a field trip for special needs students the next day. Her hands moved with the steady rhythm of someone who had done this 1,000 times, yet each slice of bread, each smear of peanut butter, felt like a sacred act. She thought about the children who would eat those sandwiches, children who might not notice the care behind the meal, but would feel its warmth in their bellies, its promise in their smiles. To Jane, a meal was never just food. It was a chance to show a child they were seen, that they mattered. It was a spark of hope, a stepping stone toward a future where they could thrive. As she wrapped the sandwiches carefully, her heart swelled with a quiet joy, the kind that comes from knowing you've done something right, even if the world might never fully understand. In a society that often prized rules over empathy, Jane Evans had chosen a different path. She had dared to listen to her heart, to see the hunger in a child's eyes and act without hesitation. That single choice, born of compassion, had sparked a movement. It had changed laws, reshaped schools, and inspired countless others to look beyond the rulebook and see the human beings in front of them. As she stood in her kitchen, surrounded by the echoes of the lives she'd touched, Jane knew her legacy wasn't in the sign glowing in the distance or the protocols bearing her name. It was in the future she'd helped build, one meal at a time. And in a world that often overlooked the small acts, Jane had proven that sometimes the tiniest gesture, a sandwich, a kind word, a moment of care, could leave the greatest mark.